I would like to call upon our next speaker to begin closing off the contributions that the panelists have before we go into our book launch and our Q&A. Dr. Carol Nakle, are you with us?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly, and the floor is yours to take.
Thank you very much, and I hope you can see me as well. You know, I'm perhaps one of the few economists on your panel today, and unlike what Professor Cameron expected, I have no slides. So I would like to discuss with you my own understanding of how the energy transition will impact oil and gas producers in Africa. Now, when I talk about the energy transition and I look at it from the developing world perspective, and if I'm giving this kind of talk, for example, in the rich world, I tend to get more criticism than an understanding, but it's very important to highlight that even though everyone around the world perhaps has the same understanding of what energy transition means, whereby we're hoping to move from a world where our consumption of energy is coming primarily from fossil fuel to a world where our energy mix is dominated by green source of energy, such as renewable energy, as well as nuclear power. Now, we all share that same understanding, but where we become more divergent in terms of our interpretation of that, what that means in terms of policies, in terms of practices, this is where you find a huge gap between the rich world and the developing world. And not only that, it's first of all, we have to think about not only the level of economic development between countries, but also in terms of economic structures. So we do also have the net oil and gas importers versus the net oil and gas exporters, and not all oil and gas producers, I can put them in the same basket because you have some which are much more dependent on oil and gas revenues than other economies which are more diversified. So these are all very important aspects to take into consideration when discussing how we approach the energy transition in, let's say, countries, oil and gas producers in sub-Saharan Africa versus, let's say, a country which has a well-diversified economy and does not rely as much on oil and gas revenues. Another thing to keep in mind is the difference between the short term and the long term. The energy transition is a long-term process if history is of any guide. And I think today the priority is, of course, to get over the crisis. But let me now just share with you some thoughts about the energy transition so that you understand how I built my conclusion and my message to you today. First of all, when we started talking about energy transition, of course, it's a noble cause to work hard to achieve, but we all thought at the beginning that it was going to be very smooth and cheap. And let me share with you a quote, one of my favorites, from the former Green Environment Minister in Germany, who said in 2004, and I quote, when he was referring to the burden placed on households by the renewable energy policies, would amount to only around €1 per month, the price of a scoop of ice cream, he said. Fast forward 10 years later, the then Federal Minister for Economic Affairs and Energy said that the cost of the energy policy, the green energy policy, and the transformation of our energy supply could add more than €1 trillion in the coming years. So that's a massive difference between the price of a scoop of ice cream to really, we're talking about the $1 trillion of investment. The second important thing, so that's the first thing, it's not going to be cheap. And therefore, we have to think about funding the energy transition. And this takes me to my second point about the oil and gas producers, such as the one we have in sub-Saharan Africa. First of all, green energy in general, whether we like it or not, and I understand that the costs have been declining quite rapidly, and it's something quite amazing to see this kind of improvements in efficiencies for solar panel, for wind turbines. But still, in one way or another, if you look at the entire system, so if you look at the system cost, you can see that renewable energy, specifically, and green energy, so I'm talking here about also green projects such as carbon capture and storage, for instance, they require direct or indirect government backing. And this takes me to the important question about what happens when in economies where government revenues come primarily from the oil and gas sector. And this is typically the case of sub-Saharan oil and gas producers, which tend to suffer from poor economic diversification and which rely largely on oil and gas revenues. I'm thinking here of Nigeria. More than 90% of government revenues come from oil and gas. And here you have two effects. First of all, you have the fact that when you want if you want to invest in a sector which requires government support, therefore you need to generate more revenues from the oil and gas sector to fund that other sector you want to see growing. And in this respect, the energy transition in these single commodity economies would mean actually more oil and gas production, not less oil and gas production. Otherwise, you will struggle to find the funding to promote renewable and green energy. So that's one thing to keep in mind, to link the energy transition with the degree of economic diversification in these economies. The second point is another consequence of the lack of economic diversification in such economies. And it's not only just in sub-Saharan Africa, it's in the Middle East as well, it's in Latin America. So it is in countries which lack the economic diversification and rely on oil and gas revenues for a big chunk of government revenues and of GDP and export revenues. Is the fact that we have pro-cyclical fiscal policy. Now, I know that most of you are not non-economists, but let me simplify that. It simply means that government spending is kind of trails changes in oil price. So when oil price increases, government becomes richer, and as a result, their spending increases. When prices go down, as we saw recently, the drastic decline in oil prices, we see governments are now seeing all sorts of spending cuts because their revenues have shrunk. And the axe typically falls on industries that require government support, financial support. And in this case, I am thinking of the green energy, which requires government backing. So in these economies, I feel we might see this investment in the green sector might suffer because of the current situation. Now, if I look at a little bit longer beyond what we have at the moment, if we look at the recovery, when we go through the improvement of the current situation, now, first of all, we have to remember everyone will be poorer, whether governments, consumers, or companies. And that's one thing. I remember what I said earlier about the energy transition not being cheap. Second, even before COVID-19, before the pandemic, the world was suffering a rising income inequality. And that it was so strained that any changes, let's say, in making an important aspect of people's spending, like energy, any kind of step to make energy more expensive, unleashed all sorts of protests all around the world. I'm not just talking only about the poorer nations. Think of the Gilets jaunes in Paris, the protests that swamped France for several months as people protested against the rise in the cost of fuel. So I fear that today, that because everybody's getting poorer, then we have to think twice about making, for example, pushing for a more expensive energy, unless you make that energy really cheap. And this takes me to the third feature of the current situation, that is the low oil price environment. Not just oil, it's also gas and coal. And this makes me think that competition actually is going to intensify for green energy, because fuels compete against each other, particularly in the power sector where all fuels compete against each other, and therefore the relative prices of fuel is going to be to play a major role in determining the direction of consumption pattern, like where we're going to get our energy from. Taking even a further longer view, Professor Peter talked about the potential of peak oil demand. And the interpretation I get from peak oil demand is simply that the oil market, which has been growing for decades, is suddenly to start shrink. So demand is going to start declining, it's going to reach a peak and starts declining. As a result, the oil market is going to shrink. And in the shrinking market, the high-cost producers will be at a disadvantage. So it's usually the low-cost producers, such as the one you find in the Middle East, are going to stay in the game the longest. But the high-cost producers, including those in sub-Saharan Africa, are going to be put at a disadvantage. And this takes me to a very important conclusion here, that these countries should really focus on getting their oil and gas wealth that is today in the ground and convert it into a more sustainable wealth that will last them for many generations to come. And I fear on this point in particular, sub-Saharan African oil and gas producers have not quite done a good job. So the track record has been poor, and this could be an opportunity, because if they don't get it right, I fear that they would suffer on many fronts. And as an economist, here I have to emphasize not really the fact to push for energy transition. There is something, a more important condition that I started with my presentation today, that is economic diversification. As long as these economies remain hugely reliant on oil and gas revenues, I fear the energy transition is not going to take off properly in these economies. It will simply mean more oil and gas, not less oil and gas. And on this point, I'll even welcome your questions during the discussion.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for that strong economic perspective. You really cut through to the real heart of the issues regarding this.